Can you tell us what the term collective crime means as a legal concept and as a moral contradiction?
Israel has been committing crimes together with the diplomatic, political, military, and economic support, enablement of a number of states. And while no state is completely innocent, there are certain states who are more complicit than others.
So, the question here is that while most democracies around the world continue to avoid using the word genocide, they are also obligated to punish incitement, commission, or complicity with genocide. Doesn't this situation reveal the contradiction between their political will and their legal duty?
There might be a ceasefire which has not stopped the fire, which has not stopped the killing. More than 200 Palestinians have been killed, in fact, in Gaza alone since the beginning of the ceasefire. But the genocide, meaning the destruction of the Palestinian people as such, continues. Why would someone else have to decide on the fate and the governance of the Palestinians? What happens to the obligation to prevent grave breaches of international humanitarian law?
Your report mentions India among states that have deepened strategic and technological ties with Israel. Between India's historic support for Palestine and its active partnerships with Israel and the US, and its claims of being the voice of the global South, does India's role illustrate a wider shift in how post colonial states respond to international law and power?
India is no longer the country that was politically. It doesn't play the role that it used to play 30, 40 years ago in the international community.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Gaza Stories. I'm Muneef Khan. In October 2025, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, presented another crucial UN report titled Gaza Genocide, a Collective Crime. Now, it states that the ongoing genocide is not just a result of Israel's actions, but that of a global system of complicity that sustains and normalizes them. She describes the four pillars of external support to Israel's genocide: the diplomatic, military, economic, and the humanitarian support, and concludes that without the participation and silence of other UN member states, this genocide could not have been sustained for over 2 years. The report also raises uncomfortable questions about the failure of international law, selective application of justice, and the erosion of moral responsibility among states and international corporations. Those questions implicate not just Western powers, but influential states in the global south, including India. In this conversation, we examine the architecture of impunity that allows such violence to continue, and to ask what it would really mean in real terms to confront it. Francesca Albanese, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My first question, and it goes straight to your report, and your report it states, I quote, "The genocide in Gaza is not the crime of one state alone. It is a collective crime facilitated by the indifference, cowardice, and active complicity of those who had the power and the duty to stop it." Can you tell us what the term collective crime means as a legal concept and as a moral contradiction?
In a very simple way, the term means what it says, that the crime has not been committed by one actor alone, but one state alone, but it's in fact the result of a constellation and a series of acts and omissions that altogether have enabled the main perpetrator to act as it has. And in fact, I do argue that over time it has been states' obliviousness to Israel's crimes, states' negligence to the very same, states' lack of compliance with their obligations to make Israel accountable for its war crimes. For example, the construction of settlements after settlements, which are illegal under international law, a grave breach of international humanitarian law, or the forced displacement of the Palestinians, or the use of extrajudicial killings and arbitrary arrest and detention. All these has been tolerated together in the broader context of the taking off the land of the Palestinians in order to build settlements. So the overall plan behind the forced displacement of the Palestinians has been ethnic cleansing all along in order to annex the land. This has been tolerated. And over time, in the past 2 years, Israel has been committing crimes together with the diplomatic, political, military, and economic support, enablement of a number of states. And while no state is completely innocent, there are certain states who are more complicit than others.
And if I may come to the legal definitions and the political realities, you have emphasized that Israel's intent to destroy Palestinians as a group, physically and socially, remains visible in, let's say, official statements, siege policy, and the sustained obstruction of aid. So the question here is that while most democracies around the world continue to avoid using the word genocide, they are also obligated to punish incitement, commission, or complicity with genocide. Doesn't this situation reveal the contradiction between their political will and their legal duty?
Absolutely. First, let me say the insistence on my part and other legal experts and genocide scholars on the use of the term genocide is critical, not just because of states having failed to prevent, having failed to punish acts of genocide. It's really to understand what the end game is here. Because you see, a war is often generally stopped by a ceasefire here or a peace plan. Here, these words are used in the wrong context because while there might be a ceasefire which has not stopped the fire, which has not stopped the killing, more than 200 Palestinians have been killed, in fact, in Gaza alone since the beginning of the ceasefire. But the genocide, meaning the destruction of the Palestinian people as such, continues through the same and other means than before, other than violent carpet bombing. However, there is an intimate contradiction between states' behavior and their legal duties. So between political will and legal duties. The dissonance is between the obligations stemming from the UN Charter, the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions that apply in circumstances of hostilities and other peremptory norms of international law, including the erga omnes obligation, an obligation that is upon all member states to realize the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. And the reluctance, there is a reluctance to confront Israel. International law doesn't permit neutrality in situation of international crimes. And in fact, failure to act, but also actions that enable the violation, transform silence and inaction into complicity. And the complicity of influential third states is what has enabled the systemic violations against the Palestinians. Now, this is not just a problem for the Palestinians and the Israelis who are trapped into this system. It's also for the international system as a whole, because the international system is made of duties that are meant to protect all of us. But the moment the Palestinians' right of self-determination becomes disposable and obliterable, think of what they call the peace plan with a transitional force to be deployed. Why would someone else have to decide on the fate and the governance of the Palestinians? What happens to the obligation to prevent grave breaches of international humanitarian law? What about the obligation to ensure unfettered humanitarian aid or to protect a member state, since now there is also an increasing recognition of the state of Palestine, from aggression? You see, all these has basically contributed to erode the solidity and the capacity to protect of the international legal system, because its enforcement mechanisms do not work. And we see the fallout in other parts of the world. I do believe that, like many others, that there is a direct link between the ferocity of the assault in Sudan and what is going on in Gaza, what has been going on in Lebanon and in other Arab states that have been aggressed with Israel and others, supported by others, targeting civilian objects. So in this context, civilians are no longer to be protected once, they become targets and targetable.
And I want to come to the architecture of diplomatic complicity. You trace how vetoes, abstentions, and the dilution of UN resolutions have created a quote-unquote diplomatic shield that is indispensable to Israel's tactics. Can you explain this deliberate political choice by powerful states to preserve Israel's impunity?
Yeah, diplomatically, there are at least two components that come to my mind. How discursively Israel has been allowed to operate as it has, because Israel has invoked an Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense, when it was clearly prohibited from doing so. Because self-defense, like the right to wage a war, can be invoked or can be legitimately claimed when authorized by the Security Council. This is not the case, or when there is an aggression from another state, by another state, which is not the case. Israel has suffered an attack from the population it maintains under occupation. It has maintained under occupation for 57 years. And it's out of question that the assault that Israel faced on October 7 was very violent and targeted civilians, had terrorist elements, because of course targeting civilians for political goals is terrorism in its simplest and crudest form. However, what happened didn't justify a response outside the realm of law and order. Israel was allowed to take measures within the framework of international humanitarian law and not resorting to war under the UN Charter. So this is the reality. And nonetheless, discursively, member states have continued to sustain Israel's claims to self-defense, reciting the mantra that Israel has the right to defend itself in the face of increasing numbers of buildings destroyed, neighborhoods erased, people killed. 70% since the beginning of the victims have been children and women. Not that men do not count, but children in particular, 40% since the beginning. I mean, this is the demography of Gaza. Nonetheless, Israel has continued to be sustained by, oh, but this is Israel's self-defense. No, it was not self-defense. It shouldn't have been self-defense. It was not executed as self-defense. And it has been a violation of each and every norm of international humanitarian law, the law of war, since the very beginning. And on top of this, when Israel, since the beginning, since the 8th of October, denounced the curtailing of essential supplies, water, food, electricity, or medicines to Gaza, this was already a condemnation to death by starvation and the lack of other essential supplies. And there are member states, including UK leaders and others, who have said, well, it's Israel's right to do so, in order to eliminate the enemy. No, and also eliminating Hamas, eradicating Hamas. And again, I'm not defending Hamas. I'm just saying that eliminating a political entity, like demilitarizing another state, these are political goals. These are not military goals, therefore not protected under international humanitarian law. You see? And discursively, member states have shielded Israel from accountability. Also, amplifying the narrative of Palestinians as human shields used by Hamas. Well, there was no evidence that that Hamas was using human shields, although it's credible that urban guerrilla in a situation of crowdedness like that of Gaza result into de facto shielding oneself again behind human life. I'm not saying that. It's just that there is evidence, ample evidence, that it's Israel who has used human shields. Have you heard any criticism of that? Have you heard any criticism of soldiers misbehaving, violating Palestinians' intimacy, privacy, raping detainees, or desecrating Palestinian places of faith. So it's been brutal and abysmal, the difference in judgment that has been used against Israel vis-à-vis the Palestinians. On top of it, and this is the second element of this diplomatic shielding, member states, particularly from the West, but without real great influence and support and leverage from other states, other than a few exceptions like South Africa or Malaysia, Namibia, the majority of Western states has used international fora to delay and dilute the possibility of a ceasefire resolution, insisting on condemnation of Hamas for October 7, like if on those words depended the fate of the Palestinians in Gaza and the fate of the Israelis. This has harmed people on the ground, primarily Palestinians, but also Israelis. And again, I think that this has played in the hand discursively and politically in the hands of the Israeli genocidal policies. Last but not least, Israel continues to be welcome in international fora, not just the UN, from which it is my strong belief that Israel should have already been suspended, as it was for South Africa decades ago. But there is also the fact that Israel continues to be welcome in sport fora, cultural fora, music fora, from Eurovision, UEFA, FIBA, the Venice Biennale, etc. And this is part of the normalization and legitimization of what Israel continues to do.
And if I could come to the question of arms transfers, you document continued weapons transfers to Israel despite clear evidence of their atrocities in Gaza. But can you explain the legal threshold to the concept of aid or assistance in an internationally wrongful act? In your view, does it adequately address complicity when the role of military-industrial complex is entrenched?
Let me explain briefly for those who have not read the report what I mean by entrenched complicity of the military sector. The global military supply chain that spans across at least 19 states through the F-35 program alone has spread responsibility across a transnational industrial complex that profits from and sustains Israel's military operations. The structural entanglement blurs legal accountability because member states say, but I'm not transferring weapons. I'm just contributing to create part of this weaponry system as part of the F-35 program. But it's the ensemble that allows Israel, to afford the means to commit its crimes. And this also allows a state to claim economic and contractual necessity while materially enabling unlawful acts. So this system, after all, this shared responsibility, and which is the essence of the collective conduct, has become a shield for complicity. And now, how do I think that the legal threshold for aid and assistance operates? Look, under Article 16 of International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility, a state is responsible for internationally wrongful acts. A state is internationally responsible if it knowingly, so with knowledge, aid and assist another state in committing an internationally wrongful act. All the more when this act amounts to a crime under the Rome Statute, for example. And this happens when the assisting state is aware of the circumstances and the fact that the act would be wrongful if committed by the state itself. So given the overwhelming evidence of atrocities and UN and other independent experts' warnings of genocide, continued arms transfer and military coordination meets and likely exceeds this threshold, as suppliers cannot plausibly claim ignorance, all the more in light of the April 2024 pronouncement of the International Court of Justice in the case of Nicaragua versus Germany, the member states are prohibited from transferring weapons or components to a state which is committing violations of international humanitarian law, meaning war crime, destroying hospitals, targeting civilians, violating the principle of distinction or proportionality or military necessity. And this was clear after the first hours of the attack against Gaza post-October 8, 2023. So again, I think that now on the basis of this, it's upon national courts to also investigate, and if there is enough evidence, prosecute, and if there is sufficient credible evidence, convict those who have been complicit in this or partaking in Israeli crimes.
And I also wanted to bring up the aspect of trade, finance, and technology. Your report details how trade, finance, and technology transfers to Israel have sustained the occupation. The report also warns that companies supplying materials or digital infrastructure may face liability for complicity. But at what point does economic engagement become unlawful assistance? And why has economic complicity historically, I'm saying, been treated as a less serious than military complicity?
Yeah. You might remember that in my previous report, the one which I submitted to the Human Rights Council before summer this year, I did mention that there is an economic and financial underpinning to the crimes committed by Israel. And this is typical of settler colonial infrastructures. This is typical of settler colonial endeavors where perhaps historically the private sector, banks, entrepreneurs, and others have traditionally been the drivers or the enablers of settler colonial conquest, dispossessions, and related crimes. In 2025, maintaining normal trades with the state, despite the illegality of its conduct, in this case, the illegality of its occupation and other systemic human rights abuses and humanitarian law violations that now have escalated into genocide, legitimizes and sustains the violations themselves. Over time, I argued in my previous report, the private sector has become, or private interests that are clearly connected also to states, not just to private entities as such, as I demonstrate in my last report, Gaza Collective Crime. All this has been the backbone of Israel's apartheid regime. Israel would have not strengthened itself as a system of oppression and domination over the Palestinians had it been for the support from industries and businesses and banks, pension funds, and the normalizing effect of university research centers, etc., and even NGOs to an extent. However, when it comes to state, the responsibility is even more tangible. I'll give you an example, because member states have an obligation, as I was saying before, not to aid and assist a state which is committing wrongful acts. It was clear, it was documented, it was known that Israel was committing the wrongful acts, all the more crimes. So, since 2014, for example, European Commission Research and Innovation Framework, that is called the Horizon Program at the moment, has provided over 2 billion euros in grants to Israeli entities, technology and innovation. And this has been used mainly to develop dual use and military technologies. I mean, Israel is the prime recipient of this kind of funds outside the European Union, and the second most significant recipient, including within the European Union. You see the distortion. You see that public funds are transferred to an entity to a state which is committing crime. Of course, there are responsibilities. So this is why there should be an investigation on who has enabled this, who has taken these decisions. Also, global trade and finance have continued to bankroll Israel's occupation, and both primarily the US and Europe have financed Israeli military, Israeli military industry or military-linked firms. International trade accounts for over half of Israel's GDP, with the European Union providing 1/3 of the total trade. So imagine the European Union stopping because of compliance with international law, to be the first trading partner of Israel. And instead, this would have stopped Israel's killing machine, because it would have created a hurdle for Israel. And instead, Israel has not only been held accountable, has continued to be incentivized, because in fact, my last report demonstrates that trade has continued to flourish. And Israel has been trading weapons that have been tested and perfected on the shoulders of the Palestinians. So this is why eventually my two reports have to be read together as contributing to perfect a mode of domination known as what in scholarship is called colonial racial capitalism, where the financing and profiting goes to enable and sustain crimes. This is true through the surveillance and carceral technology, or other forms of spying and mass containment strategies and means that Israel has been using against the Palestinians.
And I also wanted to come to the aspect of humanitarian laundering. You write that humanitarian aid, when decoupled from political action, can legitimize an unlawful situation. You have called it humanitarian laundering. Can you tell us how this is being used to normalize rather than resolve structural violence in Palestine?
Yeah, I've had this in my mind for a long time, in the sense there is also an Israeli author, an Israeli architect whose work I really appreciate, Professor Eyal Weizman, who many years ago, discussing the aid infrastructure operating in Palestine that the United Nations and non-governmental organizations have contributed to set up in the occupied Palestinian territory within the margins, within the perimeter of the occupation, has turned into what he calls the humanitarian paradox. This concept is very close to what I call the humanitarian catastrophe to manage in perpetuity that the international community has transformed the Palestinian question into. Because instead of resolving the illegality of the occupation by forcing its dismantlement, by cutting aid and assistance to Israel, by holding Israel accountable, there has been a fostering of the dependence of Palestinians on aid structures. Even before October 2023, the Gaza Strip, for example, was under an unlawful blockade that had rendered 80% of Gaza's population aid dependent. 80%. And of course, the situation worsened soon after October 2023 with the attacks. Just between October 2023 and January 2025, aid delivery shrunk. I mean, in the context of the blockade, imagine a situation that was relying on 500, 600 trucks every day, with also some local production of agricultural, the fishing business, etc. All this has been destroyed, while the trucks have been reduced to 100 per day. And of course, these figures have dropped over time, while also the UNRWA distribution centers, the main distribution network in the Gaza Strip, was attacked. 23 distribution sites were destroyed. Over 350 UN staff were killed, while also spreading unsubstantiated allegations of UN complicities in the illegal activities and even in the Hamas attack against Israel. You know, this has created a humanitarian impasse in Gaza. Therefore, little by little, the humanitarian possibilities have moved from the UN to the hands of Israel and the United States, which created this death trap that has been called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has been dismantled now. But still, its philosophy remains in place because it's no longer the UN operating in Gaza to distribute aid. It's someone else. Now it will be someone else as part of this externalized governance. So you see, not only the Palestinians have been trapped into the aid in perpetuity situation, but also this has been curtailed from them by transferring the possibility to provide aid uniquely to the state who was causing their deprivation, their dispossession, their starvation, the destruction of everything that could keep them alive. And of course, I call it this humanitarian laundering. What is humanitarian laundering? The fact that member states have felt good with their conscience by dropping aid, which was absolutely ridiculous to meet less than drops in the ocean for what were the needs of the Gaza population, but also amid the bombardment. Of course, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that Israel stops bombing while aid is being distributed. But also, why not to open the crossing points with Israel? Why not to properly regain control of Rafah? So, you know, it's so sadistic what has been done to the people of Gaza that there won't be enough pages at the disposal of one person alone or even one commission alone to describe it in a lifetime.
And my question also comes to the global south and India in specific. You know, your report mentions India among states that have deepened strategic and technological ties with Israel. Between India's historic support for Palestine and its active partnerships with Israel and the US, and its claims of being the voice of the global south, does India's role illustrate a wider shift in how post-colonial states respond to international law and power?
No, I don't think that India is anymore the voice of the global south. It depends also what we mean by global south. The global south itself is changing, but India is no longer the country that was politically. It doesn't play the role that it used to play 30, 40 years ago in international community. Today, India and the relationship with Israel demonstrates that is aligned with right-wing forces. And again, I won't comment on it on a domestic level, but let me give you some key data that I've gathered from my own investigation. Between 2020 and 2024, India has been the largest importer of Israeli weapons, accounting for 34% of the import. Although again, this is something that I didn't refer to in the report, but it is open source. India's participated in training exercises alongside the Israeli Air Force, and so it has moved from a country that in 1949 voted against the partition plan of Palestine and has been a critical advocate of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, to even abstain in 2024 on the advisory opinion discussing the self-determination, reasserting the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people and their right to be free from perpetual occupation and apartheid. So India is an example, in my view, of how post-colonial states might evolve into aligning with policies and practices of the states that once colonized them. And India has its own internal issues, but this is the reality today. So from anti-colonial solidarity to strategic alignment with systems of oppression.
And then comes the question of the duty of non-recognition. You emphasize that states must not recognize or assist situations born of genocide, apartheid, or occupation. Given that most states continue to maintain extensive diplomatic and economic ties with Israel, is non-recognition still a meaningful legal tool, or has it just become symbolic?
You mean the recognition of a state of Palestine?
Yes, yes.
I think that the answer is under our eyes. I was saying in July 2025, there have been two political developments. On the one hand, there were a number of states led by primarily global south states, Malaysia, Colombia, Namibia, Senegal, and others, advocating for an end to the assault against Gaza, an end to the genocide, an application of international court decisions and measures to stop trading goods and weapons with particularly weapons, and also not offering ports toward Israel. Then elsewhere, you had member states discussing a two-state solutions with a number of Western states, including the UK, including France, thoroughly recognizing the state of Palestine. And my objections back then were two. Having said, welcome, finally, you did recognize the state of Palestine. Very well. Now, what are you going to do with it? Because the fact that you recognize the state, it means that you have even higher or heightened obligations to protect its territorial integrity from aggression, its right to non-interference, and also assist in case of attack in the name of self-defense. And again, I said, without protection, the recognition will mean nothing. And this is confirmation. I mean, what's going on today confirms my fear that that recognition was no more than a fig leaf to show that member states were doing something of zero impact on the life of the Palestinians.
And this brings me to my final question, and this has more to do with the future of international law. You end your report by writing that the world stands, and I quote, on a knife edge between the collapse of international law and the hope for renewal. What kind of renewal do you imagine? Is the problem that international law has always responded to distribution of power more than the pursuit of justice?
Look, I don't think it's very much. I don't think that the problem today is with the wording of the law. It's rather with its application. You have member states who are, for their own considerations, interests, or cowardice, abdicated from the idea of complying with international law. So they are reordering themselves around the most powerful, the most influential, and unfortunately, we have some of the most influential states doing everything they can to demolish, to erode the international system premised upon multilateralism, centered around the United Nations. I mean, we have seen that most of the conflicts these days, yes, they are discussed inside the UN Security Council or General Assembly, but the decisions are not taken there. They're taken in Washington or Brussels or elsewhere. And yes, you have Russia and China and other BRICS countries sort of intervening. But what is needed, in my view, and maybe there is a good degree of idealism in this, but it's for a new multilateralism, giving full meaning to the United Nations and protecting peace and stability. I mean, the United Nations was not created to advance immediately, to advance the human rights of everyone. No, it was to avoid another nuclear war. Or the risk of a nuclear war, to avoid another world war, with the consequences that we had seen in Europe primarily, but also in Japan with the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So today, we are getting closer and closer to a risk of a global conflagration, with the normalization of the discussion of around war and nuclear war. And I'm saying, is there anyone with has a sense of preservation and protection, understanding that we are not misusing something that we have inherited from our ancestors, but something that we are borrowing from our heirs, from our children? And there is this total disrespect for the majority of the world, for the environment, from everything we get. So I say probably we should have a multilateralism reoriented about preserving and protecting this very idea of peace and stability. But in these, we need to make courageous choices and tell those member states who behave like bullies, you know what, we cannot follow you. Yes, we want to be your allies, but not like this. We also have some wishes. We cannot bend backward and forward to accommodate your needs because this is going to harm us, harm our children, the planet, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's about really reimagining a way to be together, premised upon peace and the maintenance of peace, instead of seeing how to make sure that we arm ourselves up to our ears and teeth, because the moment you arm yourself, those weapons have to be used one way or another. And this is where I think that we are moving closer and closer toward a deadly scenario for all of us, instead of the more idealistic and preserving one that will allow all of us to see a brighter or a less dark tomorrow.
Francesca Albanese, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.